بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to lecture 3 in our class of tafsir, continuing with this introduction to the principles of tafsir and reading this book. We're going to complete this inshallah in today's lecture. I don't want to spend more time on it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, the axis of the surahs of the Quran. So every surah of the Quran has a main theme. So we want to talk about that. Some more recent mufassirs are taking this up, but it's something that's kind of like virgin territory. But to understand, well, what is Surah Al-Fatih about? What is Surah Baqarah about? What is Surah Yusuf about? Etc. And of course, there'll be differences of opinion. The next principle is independent inference. What is that? What is the original? Oh, yeah. The meanings of how you understand the basic meanings of the verses. So there's a specific context of the verse, like the verse was revealed because of such and such happened. But then you can extrapolate from that, you can infer from that a general meaning. So how do you do that, and what kind of meanings does that give us? That's going to be a principle of tafsir. And then we're going to talk about what we call as sunan al-kawniyya, or sort of divine principles in creation. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the stories of the people in the past and things like that, stories of the prophets, what are those general principles? What are the values and the ethics and the first principles of the Quran that are spelled out in the Quran? That's another major principle. And then we're going to talk about the large conjugation, al-ishtiqaq al-kabir, which is a form of conjugation, because of course Arabic is a language that has conjugation. So we're going to talk about the words, the words in the Arabic words are in the Quran. If you flip around the letters and they create other words that have meanings, collectively, what do all of those words together mean? These are the principles that we're going to talk about today, and with that we will conclude this sort of introductory 3-part, and then we'll begin the tafsir tomorrow. So I'll talk to you in the next clip, inshallah. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about, what are the themes of each surah. I showed you a book yesterday by a later scholar, Muhammad al-Ghazali, the famous Egyptian Azhari, the thematic tafsir of the Quran. This is a little bit different. This is not about sort of a summary of the surahs. This is sort of an approach to say this surah is about such and such. So what is Surah Fatiha about? Surah Fatiha about is Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. It's about, or you can argue, you can say that. Of course, other people will look at it from a different perspective. So there is some subjectivity into what I'm saying. Of course, I'm just kind of going through the book. But Surah Al-Fatiha, for example, is about ubudiyya. It's about worship and the fundamental aspects of worship. Well, then what is the theme of the Baqarah? What is Al Imran, and so on and so forth? So you can do that for the 114 surahs, and you just kind of keep going backwards and backwards and backwards till you extrapolate and you say, okay, this is what the surah is about. That's very helpful and very useful. So when you go back to the minutia of the surah and the stories of the surah, you can also then start to relate that to the principle, and then that's how you can prove your point. If you're trying to do this as a scholar, this is how you would prove your point, saying, yes, this is what the surah is about, or what it's not about. Another thing related to this, he doesn't mention this in the chapter, but this is from me. Another thing related to this is to then ask, well, why is the surah named this? And then that takes us into another discussion, which is that the surahs have multiple names. And in some Qur'ans, in other parts of the especially in Asia, you will find the Quran will have different names for the surahs, and some people get upset with that. Of course, we're moving probably within the next generation or two, everything will be completely standard. But the names of the surahs, there are multiple names. Why do we have those multiple names? So Surah Al-Baqarah is called Surah Al-Baqarah. Obviously, it has to do with the story of Al-Baqarah. I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? So is the theme of that surah in that name and in that story? If I were to argue, that would be my basic initial way of thinking. That would be my thinking. Obviously, the answer to the question of what is the theme of Surah Al-Baqarah is in the story of Al-Baqarah. So I would look at those, sequence of verses, is about a page, with Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam in the Baqarah, and then try to extrapolate that from that some kind of principle. So Shaykh Usama, he says, rahimahullah, that about Al-Baqarah, the surah revolves around the question of surrendering to God and how it is the greatest portal of entry into the state of realizing one's slavehood to God, etc. Okay, that kind of works with what I just said, because Surah Al-Baqarah, or the story of the Baqarah, is about people not wanting to comply with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to do. So this is an important principle for the Mufassir, and something that we hope more people will take seriously in the coming generations. He says scholars may disagree on which verses constitute the axis of a particular surah, or even on the very issue that constitutes the axis of that surah. There may be elaborate debates about the difference between what constitutes an axis and what a purpose. These differences will surely enrich the Quranic studies and lead to uncovering dimensions of meaning that had gone unnoticed before. For this approach is new, and I have seen no previous authors mentioning it. So this is something that we want to start doing. We want to start thinking about the principle behind it, the principle of the surah, the major theme of the surah, defending that principle. And great that other people disagree, because then that gets us into a scholarly conversation to arrive at what we think is the most accurate answer. Okay, the next principle are the inferences in the verses. Let me read for you this passage by Shah Wali Allah Dahlawi radiallahu anhu in his Fawz al-Kabir. So he says about the inferences of the Quran. He says, rahimahullah, to be fair, the exegete should study the explanation of every unusual expression in two ways, weighing it in all objectivity twice. Once according to the conventional use of the Arabs, which will give him indications as to which meanings is more appropriate and more likely to be intended. And the second, according to what precedes and succeeds the expression in question. This he should do after he has mastered the premises of this science, search for the various uses of the same term in different contexts, and study the possible consequences of ascribing a particular meaning to a term until he comes to understand which meanings are most likely to have been intended. So the first thing is that when I read a verse in the Quran, obviously I need to understand it from the pure Arabic of the time of when the Quran was revealed, the language of Quraysh, because that's what we believe it was revealed in, the dialect and the language of Quraysh. So how did the Qurayshis use these words? And then to do that, we go back in time, we look at the pre-Islamic condition of the Arabs, the Jahili Arabs and their poetry, etc. That's how our dictionaries are, so on and so forth. So the first thing he's saying is you need to understand it linguistically. And then you need to understand the verse vis-a-vis what's before it and what's after it, to make sure that you are putting the right context to it. And then that verse or that concept or that story or that issue or that theme that you're dealing with, is it mentioned elsewhere in the Quran? And then you do the same thing with it. Then you have an idea, okay, every time this word is used, every time this concept is used, I'm finding this pattern, and then I can step back a couple steps and say, okay, this is an inference that I can make from these verses. So that's a very useful, very, very useful things. The greatest example, of course, is for us as Shafi'is, is Imam Shafi'i deducing the proof of ijma' from an inference from the Quran in a verse that might not off the bat have indicated that. This is, I think it's 115. Is it in? Well, it says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولَ مِن بَعْدِ تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبَعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى وَنُصْلِهِ جَهَنَّمَ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. So Let me read you the translation of that verse. This is in Nisa 115. I was looking for the reference. Okay. He who opposes the messenger after the guidance has become clear to him and follows other than the path of the believers. That part. We shall turn him over to what he has turned to, and we shall roast him in the hell and evil destiny. Allah Ta'ala protect us. وَاتَّبَعَ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So they follow other than the community. So Imam Shafi'i said, oh, that means there's ijma', because what the community agrees to then becomes binding and you can't go against it. So this was, the famous story that Al-Bayhaqi in his Manaqib mentions of a Shafi'i, that a man came, most likely it was Al-Khadr alayhi salam, and told Imam Shafi'i, what's the proof that you have for ijma'? And he kind of like stopped and he said, I'll give you 2 days. You got to figure this out. If you don't, then you got to stop teaching. So he read the Quran multiple times and then he brought this verse. So this is an inference. Right, this is like an art, really. I mean, I understand we're talking about it as a principle, but this has got to be something that's a natural part of somebody's toolkit, and that means you have to kind of master these sciences and constantly go back to the Quran over and over and over and over and over again, in a very repetitive way for you to be able to infer from the verses these type of things. And this is just a famous example. There are multiple examples. Another thing that he says, for example, is Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu establishing the hijrah as the first year of the calendar, taking it لَمَسْجِدٍ أُسِّسًا عَلَى تَقْوَى, a mosque founded from the first day on God-fearing is more worthy of you to stand. The immediate meaning is that the mosque was founded by God-fearing men. The expression allows a variant understanding that it was founded on the first day, which is the day most worthy of being named the first day of Islam. The fitness here becomes relative. So Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu looked at that, and Imam Ali alayhi salam confirmed that yeah, the hijrah then, because that's when we began the building of the mosque. That year, that's the first year of Islam. So that's another inference. So this is another principle that we have to look at, because sometimes you get stuck when you do tafsir in the minutia of the specifics, and you forget to extrapolate from that the general things that you can benefit from, like these principles that we are giving you, which are timeless and going to be much more than simply the context in which the verse was revealed. So that becomes a very, very important toolkit, part of the toolkit of the mufassir. Okay. I have maybe a few things I want to say about this, but for time purposes, I'll do them in the next clip, inshallah. So just continuing a little bit about this idea of the inference, which is also one of those things that's a little bit on the new side, these independent inferences. So I want to read you a quote from my Sheikh, Sheikh Ali Juma, who's also Sheikh Osama's Sheikh. So he says, Sheikh Ali rahimahullah wrote an important article that was published in the Mawsu' al-Qur'aniyya al-Muqtassa. That transliteration doesn't work. 1 second. Okay, well, it's an encyclopedia of Quranic studies. I don't want to take up the time to. But he says, rahimahullah, the following: the Quranic principles we have quoted are just examples to draw attention to this mighty aspect of the Quran. They need to be researched as an independent endeavor, and the elements of each principle and the necessary premises elucidated, as well as the consequences. Then the relationships between all of these principles should be clarified so that we can build a cognitive model. Then it should be made clear how they are to be used in various domains: politics, law, sociology, education, philosophy, worship, beliefs, dawah, and so on. So this is Sheikh Ali's quote about sort of the idea to be able to start to extrapolate these principles from the Quran and the inferences, and to start to debate them and talk about them, etc. So this is a quote from from Sheikh Mustafa Abdul Karim Kasib, who wrote a book called Al-Mabadi' al-Amma fi al-Quran al-Karim, General Principles in the Noble Quran. He says there are several levels to this process. The first level is to understand it according to the context, which is how the most of the Noble Quran should be understood. This is what Shah Waliullah Dahlawi radiallahu anhu in the previous clip, the quote that I read, that's the first thing that he says. You need to understand it linguistically. The second level is to understand the Quranic sentence according to its meaning independently of the context, so long as this understanding does not diverge, contradict, or invalidate the context. This is permissible for a fair number of verses in the Quran. This is how the Quranic principles came to be. And then the third level is to understand the Quranic sentences in a manner different from that which it came and independent of the context. This is essentially not permissible, in fact, categorically forbidden. This is the manner in which the Batinis and other deviant sects carry out their exegesis. So you can say in this third part, like, zakah doesn't really mean, it's not literally about giving money. Zakah is about purifying your, process and your income and being a generous person. Okay, I mean, that all sounds good, but that's not what zakah means. Zakah, you have to pay zakah. So why? Because the first thing is I have to understand it in the context in which it was revealed, and then I have to extrapolate from it such that I don't violate its original context. Anything beyond that it's gonna crumble. So the second level, that's what we're talking about when we talk about inferences from the Quran. Okay, principle 11, the next principle is al-sunan al-kawniyya, essential laws governing human societies, which is also something that is a little bit on the new side. Let me give you this quote from Muhammad Abdu, who says, rahimahullah, the fact that God has pointed out to us that He has reoccurrent laws in His creation makes it incumbent upon us to make these the subject of a research science so that we may retain in the most complete manner the benefits it consists in the way of guidance and teaching. There should be amongst the community individuals who explain to it the laws of God and His creation, just as with other sciences and arts which the Quran mentions in some and which the scholars have explained in detail according to its instructions, such as Tawheed, Usul, and Fiqh, etc. So, there are overarching sunan, there are overarching divine principles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in the world, and these that we can glean from the Quran is very important. And again, there is some writing about this, not a lot, but it is it's something that's being picked up much more seriously. Sheikh Osama says, there is no doubt that one of the most important duties of the exegete is to acquaint himself with the science and follow up the investigations of those who study it and their incursions into psychology, sociology, and philosophy of history and other scientific domains. This is because it opens wide the doors to understanding the purposes of the Quran. Muhammad Abdu considered this science, according to the quote we just gave, one of the things about which the higher levels of exegesis cannot be reached, without which the higher level of exegesis cannot be reached. He says in his introduction to the tafsir, and here's another quote about that. So this becomes a very important approach, that we look at these macro sunan, these divine principles, and we contemplate them. Okay, the next principle 12, is to look at the science of Quranic purposes or values, principles. So, al-maqasid. What are the purposes of the Quran? Now, this should not be confused with maqasid of Sharia, because the maqasid of Sharia are narrower than the maqasid of the Quran, because the Quran is wider than the Sharia. The Sharia is just a subset, actually a minority of the Quran. Only about 3% of the Quran deals with the Sharia. So when we talk about tafsir in the Quran, we're talking about this wider stuff, the bigger stuff, the longer stuff. So this is to talk about that. He says, Shaykh Osama says, there is a difference between the science of Quranic purposes and the purposes of the law, what I just said. For the first is general, meaning the Quran, while the second is particular. For the purposes of the sacred law is also by the same token a purpose of the Quran, but there are other purposes in the Quran that are unrelated to the law, such as, for example, good manners, values, and beliefs, etc. So, he quotes Imam al-Ghazali as being one of the earliest to talk about this. So this is from the Jawahir al-Quran, and let me read you this quote from Imam al-Ghazali regarding the principles and the purpose of the Quran. As for, he says, Imam al-Ghazali said that there were six, three essential and three complementary. So Imam al-Ghazali says, rahimahullah, as for the three essential ones, they are to inform of him to whom it calls, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of the straight path that must be followed to reach him and what happens when he is reached. As for the three complementary ones, the first is to inform of the states of those who respond to the summons and the grace with which God treats them, the secret and purpose of this being to arouse yearning and desire. It is also to inform of the states of those who turn back and refuse to respond and how God will subdue and severely punish them. Its secret and purpose is to get them to heed the lessons and put fear into them. The second is to narrate the stories of the rejectors and then expose their ignorance and shameful behavior by means of debate and telling arguments. Its purpose is, as far as the side aligned with error is concerned, exposure and dissuasion, while for the side aligned with truth it is clarification, confirmation, and victory. The third is to inform of how the stations that lie on the road are caused to flourish and how to gather provision and prepare to be ready. These are the six divisions. And then he goes on to discuss them. And basically the whole book is about that. So, this is also a very important kind of approach to the issue of tafsir, is that there is sort of a rhyme and reason in the Quran, and there is obviously an internal consistency in the Quran. And one of them is that what are the mabadi' of the Quran? What are the general principles of the Quran? Because if I don't articulate those principles and I understand a specific verse and a specific story or specific sequence or theme in the Quran that violates those principles, then it's going to be, my tafsir is going to be wrong. That's why the maqasid al-sharia are so important in fiqh. If you produce through ijtihad something that violates one of the maqasid, then your ijtihad is wrong. Obviously, you've done something that violates the most basic, first principle. So this is the same case with this issue. He quotes also from Imam al-Shawkani, let me end with this quote, who writes in Irshad al-Thiqat, as for the purposes of the noble Quran that are reiterated therein, accompanied with both observational and rational evidence, and to which it attracts attention in all of its surahs and most of its stories and examples, there are three. They are only recognized by him who is capable of complete understanding: deliberate meditation, rich imagination, and superior reflection. The first purpose is to prove Tawheed, the second to prove of the life to come, and the third to prove of the missions of the prophets. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay. So continuing on this topic of this principle, we ended with that quote of Shawkani, who says there are three purposes of the Quran. One is Tawheed, one is to prove the life to come, and the third is to prove the missions of the prophets. And again, when we talk about these new type of principles, some of the things in this lecture, the other lectures, they're kind of things that you do find in the tafsirs. In this lecture, and as we finish this book, we're dealing with things that are not necessarily important, but they exist kind of in like quotes here and there, but they haven't been really zeroed in as independent works and independent approaches. And that's one of the reasons why I think this book is so important, that I begin our discussion of tafsir with it, to give you guys a sense of, I don't want you just to learn tafsir and hear from me in this classroom form some of the great tafsirs that we have, but I also want you to think about moving forward and drawing more meaning in this way. So what we just said about the maqasid of the Quran, but there's going to be debates amongst the ulama. It's not going to be, you can't just say it's absolutely this or not. It's what Ghazali said, it's not what Shawkani said, it's not what Ghazali said, etc. There will be different ways of talking about it, until the scholarly community argues and critiques one another until we get to it, to a definitive understanding. Okay, the last thing, which might be the most difficult to speak about, is the large conjugation, al-ishtiqaq al-kabir. And the different ulama call it different things. The page is not turning. I want to just read from you what Al-Razi says in his tafsir. So give me a second. This is a little bit of a long quote, but it's very important. So Al-Razi says, rahimahullah, first issue, know that the most perfect way to define the meaning of the word is that of ishtiqaq, conjugation, which is of two kinds, smaller and greater. The smaller conjugation, al-ishtiqaq al-asghar, is to derive past and future forms from the root verb or active and passive participles. So, kataba, katib, maktub, kutib, kitab, things like that. As for the greater conjugation, ishtiqaq al-akbar, it comes from the fact that words are composed of letters that are of necessary capable of being shifted around. We say the first level is when the word is made of two letters, which makes it capable of only two kinds of transformation. So you have men, nem. You only just reverse the words. Then there is the level when it is made of three letters, as in hamd. This word is capable of 6 kinds of conjugation. For each of the 3 letters can be positioned at the beginning of the word, and for each of these 3 possibilities, the other 2 letters can be in 2 ways, so that that 3 is multiplied by 2 to give 6. These are the conjugations a 3-lettered word is capable of. Following this is the degree of 4-letter words like aqrab or tha'lab. It is capable of accepting 24 kinds of conjugation. For each of the 4 letters can be positioned at the beginning of the word, and for each of these 4 possibilities, the remaining 3 letters can be arranged in 6 different orders. 4 by 6 gives 24 forms. Then there is a 5-lettered word like safarjal, which accepts 120 kinds of conjugation. For each of these 5 words may be positioned at the beginning of the word, then each of these possibilities, the letters can be arranged in 24 different orders, and 5 by 24 is 120. And then he goes on to say, second issue, know that the status of the smaller conjugation, al-ishtiqaq al-asghar, is familiar and easy to understand because we talk about it in sarf. On the other hand, ishtiqaq al-akbar is more difficult to study, and it comes that it can be studied only as far as 3-lettered words go. As for 4- and 5-lettered ones, the conjugations are too numerous, most of them are never used, so that it can be done only on rare occasions. Even 3-lettered words can rarely be meaningful in all of their possible transformations. More usually, some forms are used and some are not. The maximum one can aim for at investigating the meaning of words in linguistic studies is to investigate the forms that are actually in use. So, the greatest example that we have is the word kalima. So, kaf, lam, mim. You can also form lakama, by making the lam, kaf, mim. Lakama means to punch. Kalima is word. Malaka, mim, lam, kaf, is to own, etc. So, lamaka, lam, mim, kaf, is the one derivative of that that's not used. So, when you have that, what is the relation between kalima, lakama, malaka? What is the relation? That's what the large conjugation is. What is the underlying meta meaning of these 3 letters, the kaf, the lam, and the mim? Or kalima, kaf and lam and the mim. Because when you reverse the letters around, that's called al-ishtiqaq al-akbar. That's what we're talking about. It's going to have a larger theme. That larger theme is important because then it helps us understand the relationship of all of these words. So this is one of the unique features of the Arabic language. It's kind of the hardest to talk about because we're doing it in English. This example that I just gave you, the ulama argue that the underlying theme of all of those derivatives is strength. So, lakama, to punch, is obviously force. Kalima, there is a strength in words. Malaka, to own, is to have strength. So, strength is one of the major themes. Okay, so that's the teaching. Now we take that teaching and we go to the derivatives of those words. Like, for example, when we have the word al-malaika, the angels. So therefore, the angels are beings of strength, which is supported elsewhere in the Quran when Allah Ta'ala talks about the angels that are the keepers of the doors of the hellfire. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. عليها ملائكة غلاظ شداد لا يعصون الله ما أمرهم ويفعلون ما يأمرون. On them, on these gates, are these strong and fierce angels. So when the Arab, at the time of the revelation, the natural Arab hears the idea of al-malaika, they understand that this is this mighty being, not as it might be in some narratives in the Western world, like weak or angelic and pure and innocent and like a baby. I mean, they are innocent and pure, but the angel, as understood in the language as we've been arguing just now, is something that is large and fierce. The same thing with ownership. And milkiyya is something that is of the greatest importance to the point that it is part of the maqasid of the sharia. So this type of approach is very important linguistically for the mufassir not to be absent-minded of it, even though, as Al-Razi says, it's difficult and it takes a little bit of thinking, because you want to make sure that you understand, truly understand what are the meanings of these words. What is sought after, what is the meaning that is sought after, so that we come to interpret and we come to explain, we do so in a way that makes sense. Okay. That's really... Yeah. Okay. That's really it for the book, Alhamdulillah, which kind of, as I said, will serve as a kind of this introduction to tafsir. I want you to be exposed to understanding these type of principles. I'm not necessarily going to jump into the tafsirs in the rest of the course and go back to these principles. I just want them to be in your consciousness, and I want you to be aware that these are some of the things that we look at in tafsir. The plan for the rest of the class is that we have, so this took up 3 classes, so we have 12. So I don't know, I'll probably every 2 or 3 lectures we'll stick with one tafsir. The first tafsir we're going to do is the tafsir of Imam al-Razi. All of the tafsir is going to be about Juz Amma. So the surahs that we're most familiar with, and it's not going to be a complete tafsir of Juz Amma, but I want to give you a flavor of how like Al-Razi approaches, and then we'll move on to somebody else and another type of tafsir, keeping in the back of our minds the things that we've talked about and these principles. I want you to see that these different tafsir genres are very important. You can see that there are different approaches to the tafsir of the Quran and how rich it can be, how technical it can be, how sometimes maybe some tafsirs leave you a little bit, well, I didn't really comment about what I wanted to comment about, so you have to find it somewhere else. That also happens. And hopefully we'll have a lot of fun doing that, because it's not like academic heavy. We have to learn a lot of facts. I just want you to kind of hear and be aware of some of these approaches. That's it for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim tasliman kathira. All right, so alhamdulillah, in today's class, we did the rest of the book. And of course, I closed the book before I hit record, so now I got to find the page that we talked about. We talked about the different themes. We did that last time. Stories of the Prophets we did. Yeah, the first theme we talked about is principle we talked about for tafsir is the access meaning of the surahs. So, and that's going to be related to the names of the surah. So what is Surah Al-Fatiha about? What is Surah Al-Baqarah about? Etc. And the importance of having that kind of discussion, which is starting to happen. There's academic scholarly movement in that area. Not a lot, but it's starting. Then we talked about inferences, how we infer from the Quran out of the context of the verses a meaning that supports the context of the verses, but also gives us something that is larger. We used the example of Imam Shafi'i's inference in 115 of An-Nisa to prove ijma'. And we also used the example of the لمسجد أسس على تقوى من أول يوم أحق أن تقوم فيه. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, seeing in that verse the proof that we will begin the Islamic calendar with the Hijrah, because that's when we built the mosque. So his inference from that verse, and the inference therefore has to acknowledge the verse in its linguistic understanding, in its context, but then also extracts from it a bigger principle, which is one of the powers of the Quran, that you can do that. And then then the next principle we talked about is existing law, divine laws governing human societies, sunan al-kawniyya. And we talked about, that this is something that's also, it's been talked about, but not really done that much. So this is something that still needs to be done by the ulama. But it's very important to see how we look at different societies and communities, and the principles, the rules that Allah Ta'ala has placed in the creation of these societies. Then the science of Quranic purposes, the maqasid of the Quran, and we talked about how that's different than the maqasid of the Sharia, because it's more broad. And then we talked about the large conjugation, al-ishtiqaq al-kabir, and you can hopefully remember the example of kalama, lakama, malaka, as the supreme examples of that, and inshallah how that's important in giving us a deep, deep meaning of what the words of the Quran mean. So this is the end of kind of the introductory, these 3 lectures. Next we'll move into actually the tafsir itself. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima.